Go ahead, Mom. You're on.
Okay, wait a minute.
You wanted to ask where they sleep, remember?
Oh, wait.
Oh, okay.
Hi, welcome to On Point. Today I am so incredibly pleased to have Woodson Martin here to talk about what the heck is happening at the border. My voice is rotten, so occasionally Laura, our daughter, is going to have to speak for me. But anyway, Woodson, what I want to know, and I think what everybody wants to know, is how'd you get involved in this?
Sandy, I first got involved with issues around immigration right after Trump was elected. And my wife Kelly and I went to the San Francisco airport with lots of other people who were angry about the travel ban, the Muslim ban that Trump had implemented almost his first day in office. And we were there with signs and everything, like everybody else, at the airport protesting, and met some people. Kelly met both there and online a Facebook group of people in the area, mostly women who were organizing to welcome some refugees who were flying in, scheduled to fly into San Francisco from Afghanistan, and wanted to make sure that those people would actually get through immigration. And she went back maybe the next day or the day after and met a young man whose name was Kismet Amin, who was coming from Afghanistan, who'd been a translator for the U.S. military there and had gotten what's called a special immigrant visa, which he'd waited for several years while he was in hiding from the Taliban. And he came through immigration, got out, and Kelly was there along with several others to meet him. And we befriended Kismet. Kelly took him to the bank to help him open his first account. She talked me into helping him learn how to drive. And Kismet was our entree to kind of understanding the immigration system. We wanted to take our kids volunteering to a refugee camp. And we did all this research, and we were thinking all about the refugee crisis in Europe at the time. And so we went to France for 2 weeks to volunteer in northern France with an organization called Help Refugees. And we worked in a warehouse and did distributions of basic donated stuff, tents, so they had somewhere to sleep, and clothing and food. And it was a great experience for the family. But while we were there, all the European volunteers were saying, "Why are you guys here? Don't you have your own refugee crisis in the U.S.?" And then we were like, yeah, I guess we do. And this was right when the family separation that were happening at the border were in the news. And so I said, well, gosh, when we get back from this trip, I should go to the border and check out what's happening here. And I did, and I talked a friend into going with me. We went to McAllen, Texas. We walked into a bus station that we had heard about where volunteers were helping immigrants just being released from Border Patrol custody. And they were getting on buses to sort of go all over the country to where they had sponsors waiting for them. And we found these people who clearly hadn't had anything to eat in a long time, hadn't had the chance to shower, had no idea where they were, had no money, were getting on the bus for 3 days.
I think people are confused, Woodson, about how they come from countries and then get distributed.
Yep, it's a good point. I often talk about these things as if people understand what's happening.
Right.
So, really since 2014, there's been a huge surge of migration from Central American countries, specifically El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. The people from those countries probably make up 75% of the folks coming to the U.S. southern border, but there are literally people from every country in the world who come there to seek asylum, because it's the only place you can really walk up to the border and request asylum at a Border Patrol checkpoint. It's very hard to walk up to the checkpoints, in the interior of the United States. You can't get there without a visa. So there are thousands of people who come. every week to the U.S. border, many from Central America, many from other countries, and they're there to seek asylum. And asylum is a legal process for people to gain access to the United States to seek refuge from persecution in their own country. And that legal process provides several avenues for people to prove persecution or fear of persecution in their country. And if they successfully do that through a process that works through the immigration courts, they can gain permanent residence in the United States. And so many, many families are forced to pursue that process because of conditions in their own countries.
How do they do that, actually?
So the process of getting asylum is, it starts at the border, and it starts with a claim of asylum. So essentially you walk to a border patrol checkpoint and you say, I want to claim asylum, I fear for my safety in my country. And in theory, the person you encounter there is usually a border patrol agent, will take you into custody and hold you in some form of detention, usually in a border patrol holding cell, and until a asylum officer who works for the United States Citizen and Immigration Service can come and interview you and do what's called a credible fear interview to determine whether there's a better than 50% chance that you would be persecuted if you were returned to your country. And so if the asylum officer makes a determination that you have a credible fear, then you are admitted to the United States, and based on the discretion of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, you're either detained, held in a detention center, awaiting an appearance in immigration court, or you're given a document that's called a notice to appear, which says you need to show up at an immigration court at a certain time and place, and you're released, typically on what's called humanitarian parole, to wait out your asylum case in the United States. And most often that happens when people have a family member or a sponsor who will take responsibility for them while they wait.
Okay, and how long does that take?
That process has historically taken, 18 months to 2 years to play out. It's currently taking a lot longer, and nobody knows how much longer. I have friends today who were released into the U.S. more than 2 years ago who are still waiting for their first immigration court hearing 2 years from now. And those, once you've had your first hearing, it's quite often many, many months before you go through the sequence of hearings in front of an immigration judge before a determination is made on the merits of your case.
So
many years now.
Yeah, okay, so Joe comes over from Guatemala.
Okay.
And now he's got 2 years. He doesn't know that. He doesn't know how long, but he thinks maybe. He's got 2 years, gets a job.
Yep.
Gets a job how?
Okay. So there's a way the system's supposed to work, and then there's the way the system does work. But the way the system's supposed to work is that after being present in the United States for 150 days, after having made an asylum claim, you can apply for what's called an employment authorization document, the ability to legally work in the country. And it used to take about 30 days for that to be processed by the USCIS. You get it in the mail along with a Social Security card, and you can work while you wait out the period of your case. Trump extended that waiting period from 150 days to 365 days so that people had to survive a whole year without income with the support of whoever their sponsors were. The reality today is that process of 30 days of applying for that work authorization is taking many, many more months, and people are waiting a lot longer for legal authorization. But legal authorization to work in the United States is only one route to employment. As you probably know, there's like 10 to 12 million people who work in the United States without legal authorization. And there are many employers who are willing to hire people without papers. And there are many ways for immigrants who have run out of time and money to very inexpensively get papers that allow them to work that are false papers, that are fake green cards, or the things which you can buy on the street in the U.S. today for about $100.
Yeah. Okay. Now Joe, actually still living with his uncle or whoever, and he has a job. What then does Joe bring his friends over, his relatives, traditionally or not?
Yeah, so if Joe gets asylum, and probably at the point we're talking about now, Joe's still waiting for his court case, but when he is granted asylum, then asylees can file for what's called dependent asylum for their dependents. So if Joe is married and can show evidence of that marriage with a marriage certificate or other stuff, other documentation he has for that, he can apply for dependent asylum for his wife.
Okay.
If he has children and he can prove parenthood with birth certificates and otherwise, he can apply for dependent asylum for his kids. And those kids and those dependents don't have to qualify on the merits of their own case. They just have to prove dependency, and they have to prove that they're not a danger to the society in the United States. They aren't terrorists, they aren't criminals or something of that nature. And that process takes about 18 months to play out once someone receives an asylum claim.
So those kids, do they have trouble in their own country getting those papers?
Yeah, quite frequently access to the papers is difficult or impossible. And so some families never reunify because they can't provide the documentation needed. I'm working right now with one immigrant. He's actually from Cameroon. The papers that would prove his parenthood were in his home. Since he left the country, the home has been raided many times by the government military forces. They had a big bonfire. He presumes that all that stuff got burned. And he is afraid to ask for the paperwork from the government authorities because he thinks that will trigger persecution of his family.
Right.
So it's quite often difficult for people to come up with the paperwork.
Okay. Next step. What happens?
Yeah, so if we're talking about Joe's case now, if he's got to go through his asylum process. So he's waited for a long time for his first court appearance. That first court appearance is called a master calendar hearing. It's a very perfunctory process in front of a judge that he's waited 2 years for. He shows up in front of the judge asks him 2 or 3 questions, confirms that he intends to seek asylum, asks whether he's found legal representation. So does he have an attorney to represent him in his case? For the vast majority of immigrants, the answer to that question is no, because while you can be represented in immigration court by a lawyer, there's no public defender service for the immigration court. So if you can't afford a lawyer or you can't find one on your own, you have to represent yourself in court.
Just a minute.
Yeah.
We may have to fix this.
Yeah, that's okay. We'll do it. And this is one reason why you sometimes see these pictures in the media of children appearing alone in front of an immigration judge, as young as 3 years old in court, no representation, appearing in front of an immigration judge because there is no public defender service. There's no entitlement to representation in the immigration courts. So at that master calendar hearing, he would either have a lawyer or he wouldn't have a lawyer. If he had found a lawyer, then they would proceed to schedule his merits hearings. And that is usually 2 appearances in court where he would actually argue his case. If he doesn't have representation, typically after the master calendar hearing, the judge will give him an extended period of time to find representation. And sometimes that's a couple months, sometimes that's a year, sometimes that's 18 months, depending on how backlogged the courts are. And so Joe is waiting. So after that appearance, Joe's waiting again, either with an attorney to help him prepare his case or without. And eventually, the next step in that process would be to begin the merits process. There's a application you complete after a file, when you file for asylum, it's called an I-589 form, and it's a long multi-page form. It's in English, and all the responses have to be in English. And it requires people to produce basically an argument for why they are eligible for asylum, but also evidence to support those claims. And so all kinds of things can be evidence. I'm working with one young man right now who's from Nicaragua, who's a former police officer in Nicaragua, who basically objected to some of the corruption in the police force in Nicaragua, and as a result was attacked, beaten, and persecuted by the police force he'd been part of. He has photographs of the bruising from the hospital. He has photographs of the scars that he sustained. He has newspaper articles that tell similar stories of similar people with similar experiences that have been documented in reputable media. Yeah. He'll gather all of that as part of his case to support his 589 application. And he's fortunate because he has help to pull that together. Most asylum seekers don't really understand the process. It's not that they haven't been educated, as they don't have a legal education, right? We don't even understand the process. Most of them don't understand the process. They think they just need to go tell their story to a judge, and that any judge, hearing about their experience, how their, children were tortured, or how they were held in captivity, or how they were, that a judge would respond to that by granting them permission to stay in the United States. They don't understand that the burden of proving every allegation that they make rests on them, the respondent. And so it's a process that most don't succeed. Very few asylum cases are successful, fewer than 20% historically. And so people who pursue the process through and their asylum claims are eventually denied are most often then given deportation orders and removed from the country. Sometimes that happens after the conditions in their home country have changed because it takes so long. Sometimes conditions have gotten better in the country where they were from, and maybe that's not a big deal. But sometimes they are returned to those countries where they're tortured and killed or persecuted in exactly the ways that they had feared when they left.
Okay, which begs the question, who's there at the gate?
Yeah.
Montenegro, who is there?
Who's there at the gate?
Yeah.
Well, here at the U.S. gate, it's the Border Patrol. But, for example, if Brian were sent back to Nicaragua, when he gets off the deportation plane, ICE Air, which are the Immigration and Customs Enforcement charter planes that fly out of places like Brownsville, Texas, or McAllen, or El Paso every day to these countries in Latin America, chock full of people who they are returning to deport to those countries, they're greeted at the airport by the exact people they were fleeing from when they left, who now know, of course, that they've been returned from the United States. Almost in all the Latin American countries where essentially the real authority on the ground in most places in most of those countries is not a federal government the way that we're used to thinking about it, but it's drug cartels and other criminal elements that basically run most of these countries, and they're there to nab the people who got off the plane because these are the same people they were after to extort before they left.
Right.
And so we're quite often pushing people basically into the jaws of their torturers when we deport them.
Okay, you guys have any questions?
Yes, I have a question of you, Sandeb. We have heard from Woodson this amazing and quite sad development and story. What can you recommend to your family and friends from this hospice bed that any of us can do to alleviate this?
I'm going to switch the question over to Woodson. What can we do, Woodson?
Well, there are a lot of things that we can do individually. I think one thing we can do, we can all get educated and pay more attention to the plight of these people, and especially some of the most vulnerable, like the children who we hear about crossing the border alone. And there's lots of ways that you can learn more about that, and there's organizations that you can support who are helping them. I talked about the 3-year-old kid representing herself in immigration court. The defense for these kids is really the work of organizations like the Young Center, and the Young Center is one organization that Sandy would love for folks to support with their donations. The Young Center provides legal representation on a pro bono basis for unaccompanied children who are caught up in the immigration system. Sometimes that's just the initial help of reunification, getting those kids out of detention centers and into the arms of their sponsors. You know, we hear about unaccompanied children at the border, but the reality is many of those children came to the border in families. Their parents were with them. But by the time they got to the border, their whole family had already been through hell. You know, they'd ridden on the top of a train through Honduras and Guatemala. They'd seen other families with children who slipped off the train in the middle of the night and got crushed by the wheels. They stopped and spent the day or a week or a month in a refugee camp somewhere along the way where they saw people kidnapped and tortured, and they feared for the lives. The girls, the mothers raped, the young men in the group, their teenage sons basically hauled away for service in the gangs. They're petrified of the life south of the border for these families, and so they make the very difficult choice when our border policy doesn't let the family into safety to send the children alone while the parents stay in the danger zone in Mexico. And I've seen this personally hundreds of times where families make this agonizing choice. We also hear about unaccompanied kids because they're not really unaccompanied. There's 3 kids, 2 teenagers, one of them's 19, one of them's 17, and one of them's 13. And they come together to the border. They're family, but according to the U.S. immigration system, those are 2 unaccompanied minors and an adult. And that adult is not the parent of those children, so those children are separated from that adult, their older sibling, and they are put into the immigration detention system, and that older child, that 19-year-old, is sent to an adult detention center. So we talk about, the end of family separation, but the reality is our policies are still having the effect of separating families at the border. And organizations like the Young Center are great ways for average people to get involved, to give, to get educated, and to help these kinds of cases and these kinds of families.
Okay, you guys have another question? No?
No.
I would simply want to say, in closing, to focusing in on Sandab for a minute, as we all know, for decades now, Sandy Asper has been interviewing people for the public good. And here's an opportunity for people that are watching this to recognize that in Sandy. And on behalf of Sandy, the family Asper would like to express our appreciation to you, Woodson, for bringing this amazing opportunity of helping our fellow man to light. Thank you.
Thanks, Woodson.
Thank you.